Here are some quick notes on supernova nucleosynthesis to accompany Chapter 7 of To Build a Star. So Chapter 7 discusses, the end of stellar lifetimes, and supernovae are mentioned briefly, but not this very important consequence of them, which is that they are a source of the. And supernovae core collapse supernovae, are pretty complicated. There's a lot going on, and they're very rich in terms of being sources of nucleosynthesis. So I'll go through the many different ways that you get chemical elements from core collapse supernovae. The process itself is outlined very nicely here in this somewhat older review article from Thomas Janka, where your supernova, what you basically have is finally the iron core cannot support um, just can't repel the inward pull of gravity anymore. The core begins to collapse. You have electron captures that precipitate that and make it go faster. Your core finally bounces. You can't compress the center of your neutron star or your protoneutron star anymore. You're above nuclear saturation density. So you have basically a core bounce and a rebound. A shock propagates outward, and that shock then heats up the surrounding material, and you can get nucleosynthesis in that shock region there. Also, you're ejecting the envelope, and elements that were made previous in the envelope, those can be ejected as well. Then finally, your shock will actually stall, we believe, so that it doesn't just propagate all the way through the star and really cause the explosion. Rather, what really finalizes the explosion is that you have a very hot protoneutron star. It's basically like a neutrino light bulb, and those neutrinos will cause a wind and blow off material, and that will also drive nucleosynthesis. And this is at a bit later time, so seconds after the explosion. And we'll go through some of that in a moment. So before you have a core collapse, your massive star is undergoing lots of nuclear burning. It creates this sort of classic onion structure of the star that you probably saw in like an intro astronomy textbook. And when the envelope's ejected, a lot of those elements that are then sent off into outer space to enrich the universe. And so we've talked a bit about core hydrogen and core helium burning previously, so let me just talk about the next stages of burning. So once you've converted helium into carbon via the triple alpha process, you now have a carbon core, and that carbon can burn then via carbon-carbon fusion. Carbon can also capture alpha particles and produce oxygen-16. So you basically convert your carbon core through carbon burning to make oxygen, neon, magnesium. And if you have a star that's around 8 or so solar masses, then it will actually end here. You can get an oxygen, neon, magnesium white dwarf rather than a carbon oxygen white dwarf that you may be more familiar with. For slightly more massive stars, you can then kind of cross the Rubicon and go to a point, beyond which you cannot return. Your nucleosynthesis will continue to occur, and you will get a core collapse supernova in that case. So that next stage in burning is neon burning. It's not actually fusion of neon nuclei for the most part. It's alpha captures onto your neon that you've made and photodisintegration. And so you can photodisintegrate the neon to create more alpha particles, capture those, and you're basically just kind of converting these into oxygen and magnesium. It's not really making much new there. Then it gets a bit hotter. You can undergo oxygen burning, so this really is oxygen-oxygen fusion, and you produce a lot of silicon and some sulfur. But there are beta decays, and so it's not just these isotopes. You also still can have some helium burning and some proton burning because these are produced, and so you get a group of stuff kind of around silicon 28. And then finally you have silicon burning, and this is a very complicated large network of nuclear reactions. There's photodisintegration of nuclei, alpha captures on your silicon. You're very nearly in this situation of so-called nuclear statistical equilibrium. So basically your abundance distribution that you have is just determined by nuclear masses and the temperature. So silicon burning creates a stuff around iron. So in our cartoon picture, we usually call it an iron core or an iron nickel core. It's really elements around these. So it's true you mostly have iron and nickel, but there's a lot of other stuff produced as well, and it just kind of depends on your core temperature what you'll actually produce. And so all of this stuff is produced in this onion structure, and so when your envelope is blown off in the supernova, you release these elements into the universe, and you'll notice these are the alpha elements, right, and the iron peak. Now, if your star had some S process or some I process burning going on that we've talked about previously, then these can be released as well. Okay, so that's stuff made before the supernova that can maybe be ejected, but then there's this shock. So the shock following the core bounce, this precipitates shock-driven nucleosynthesis. So a movie of that is shown here. You have abundance in the vertical direction. The radial coordinate increases in the rightward direction. You start out with these alpha elements in your envelope, have relatively high abundances, and what the shock does is it processes these, processes these, and it winds up slightly changing the abundances of elements, right? Pretty substantially near the core where the shock has actually propagated, and then less so as you get further out because the shock begins to stall. So this shock-driven nucleosynthesis makes other elements around the iron peak, and it basically modifies your abundance distribution from what you'd get just from the onion structure. And this shock-driven nucleosynthesis is particularly interesting in my view because this can make some radioactive nuclides. So for instance, titanium-44 is made in this region, and you can actually observe the gamma decay of titanium-44 in space from its beta delayed gamma decay, and you can see how much you made, and the amount that you made is related to the details of the shock. So basically the shock-driven nucleosynthesis, trying to understand that better, gives you a window into the supernova explosion mechanism. And that's one thing that my group has worked on a bit recently. So as the shock propagates further outward, it can heat up the environment and like the oxygen neon shell so that what's possible isn't really any charged particle capture, but you can still have photodisintegration reactions. And this is what is thought to be the origin of most or many of the so-called P nuclei. So if you look at the nuclear chart, you have proton number increasing in the vertical direction, neutron in the horizontal. This is a really small slice. The black boxes and the red boxes, these are stable isotopes, so more or less infinitely lived. If you just map out a schematic neutron capture process, either the S process that we talked about last time, or the R process that we briefly mentioned as well, you can only make these black boxes here. You just cannot possibly make these stable isotopes here. So these are known as the P process isotopes, and it's believed that they're made here, and so your shock propagates outward into your oxygen neon shell and basically photodisintegrates heavier nuclei into lighter ones, and you can make many of the proton-rich nuclei this way. And in terms of nuclear physics, often what you're interested in is these photodisintegration reactions at special locations where you basically have so-called deflection point. You have a gamma alpha, for instance, competing with a gamma p, and that might lead to a very different abundance pattern. And so that's what we might study in terms of nuclear physics. So then, after your shock has stalled, you have this very hot protoneutron star that's a neutrino light bulb. Those neutrinos are blowing outwards, and they're heating up this environment again. They're reheating it, and they're re-energizing the explosion and allowing that star to explode, we believe. And depending on the details that you assume about neutrino matter interactions, then you can create a slightly neutron-rich environment. And so we say our electron fraction, this is just the number of protons divided by the number of protons plus neutrons. If that's less than 0.5, you're neutron rich. And in that case, nuclear reaction network calculations show us you have these alpha capture neutron emission reactions that drive your nucleosynthesis from sort of seed nuclei that were already existing in the envelope of the star out to more neutron-rich nuclei and to heavier elements, and you can make elements in just roughly, very schematically, the zinc to tin region. It's a bit smaller than that, but that's easy for me to remember. And so these alpha N reactions are of interest to us in nuclear astrophysics because it may be the or cause for the origin of these elements, which we do not presently know where they're made. Now, I made a point there of specifying that's if the conditions are neutron rich. They may well be proton rich. We don't actually know. That's one reason we're interested in these processes, is that they're kind of competing, and maybe they both happen. We don't know. So if you have proton-rich conditions, then you have proton capture reactions and then neutron capture proton emission reactions that drive nucleosynthesis to heavier elements. And again, in our model calculations, these can make elements from roughly zinc to tin. Now, these neutrino matter interactions are poorly constrained, so we don't know whether the wind is proton-rich or neutron-rich, or maybe both are possible, depending on your explosion details. So for instance, your progenitor mass. Some studies have tried to track down which could explain it. This is one such study. So you have a phase space that they modeled in terms of the electron fraction, so whether it's proton-rich or neutron-rich. The entropy, so this is your ratio of neutrons or protons to seed nuclei. And what's shown here is these bands tell you regions of phase space that work to explain given isotopic and elemental abundance ratios. And so where all of the regions overlap, that's where you can explain it in terms of phase space. And there are different solutions, either for slightly neutron-rich or for quite proton-rich. Now, one complication is these model calculations used a single set of nuclear physics input data. And currently, the nuclear physics uncertainties are just too large to distinguish between the two processes. So in particular, there are several important NP reactions for this so-called neutrino P process. And there are several alpha N reactions for the so-called alpha process that we talked about in the previous slide. These are too uncertain to distinguish between them. So we're working on measuring those in the lab, either directly or indirectly, to try to figure out how these elements were made. As a fun fact, this is kind of the last region of the periodic table where we don't know where the elements were made at all, which is sort of cool. And then finally, I focused here on core collapse supernovae because they're so rich. Those core collapse supernovae are also known as type 2. There's another type of supernova that is responsible for quite a bit of nucleosynthesis in the universe. And these are thermonuclear supernovae, or so-called type 1a. The type 1as, we know they are related to white dwarf explosions, or that seems to be the case. There's still some question as to whether they are only single white dwarfs that are accreting material and are driven over the Chandrasekhar mass, and then that's what causes a supernova explosion, or whether you have merging white dwarf stars. The current observational evidence tends to favor the merging scenario, but the single degenerate scenario where you have one white dwarf is not ruled out. In terms of the nucleosynthesis, both of these processes, whichever one is true, or maybe both are, you make quite a few elements around the iron peak, and then a lot of these alpha elements, so the ones that are composed of alpha nuclei, and the amount of what you make does, of course, depend on your details, so which of these explosions you have. So this is still an active area of investigation, which one of these is correct, or maybe both are. And again, there are some nuclear physics uncertainties contributing to that mystery. And that's a whirlwind tour of supernova nucleosynthesis, and that is it for these quick notes for this time.